Welcome to Xaris. If you are joining the Zoom meeting in order to follow our PowerPoint slides, you should now be seeing a picture of our logo. But before we get started, let me open us up with a word of prayer. So will you join me in a word of prayer? Father, we come before you this morning on this day, a day after I know many people were thinking about and remembering the events of 20 years ago. A sad day, not just for our country, but really for the world and for the state of our world. And I believe that grieves your heart. We are here, Lord, this morning to lift up our hearts to you, wherever they may be at, in whatever condition they may be, and ask that you would bless it now. And we thank you for our time, and we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Okay, so before we get started, there are some announcements. Trevor has an announcement that he would like to make, so I'm going to turn the microphone over to him, or a microphone.
Hello. Hey guys, I'm very excited to announce that we will be doing Operation Christmas Child again this year. This year, my sister and I will be taking over. Like similar to last year, due to COVID, we will be accepting packages and donations of $30 to prevent contamination and promote social distancing. If you were to complete the form, which will be sent out by Auntie Becky, please have it completed by October 10th. And hopefully we can do it like last year and spread God's love.
Thank you, Trevor, for taking that over and overseeing that for us. At this time, I do want to go over our upcoming schedule because we do have some updates with regards to our future Sunday morning services. If you take a look at this slide, I have our schedule detailed out through the month of October. For the most part, we are alternating between meeting here in this parking lot and meeting at SASF. Next week, we are back at SASF. And if you're wondering, I will be continuing our movie series next week, and I'm fairly certain that we'll be doing the movie Nomadland. So if you are someone who prefers to see the movies before I go over them, then you may want to watch that movie this week if you haven't already. The one update that I want to highlight, and you got a flyer in your package, is that on October 3rd, we have secured a theater at Cinemark Theaters. So we're going to hold our services inside a theater at Century Theaters here in Elk Grove. It will not be a typical service. In fact, it will be a very short service, if you can still call it that. Cinemark is allowing us to have a complimentary 30 minutes inside the theater before the movie starts. We are seeing Shang-Chi and the Legend of the Ten Rings, and the movie will begin at 10 a.m., and it will begin immediately at 10 a.m. because we've requested that there be no previews. However, we are asking, if you can, that you come at 9:15 a.m. Since they are giving us this 30 minutes before the showtime, we want to be at the front doors so that when they open them at 9:30, we can quickly enter the theater, and then maybe we'll have about 20 minutes to just hold a brief service. So after we meet at SASF next week, an email will be going out with a link for you to indicate if you will be attending. The theater is limited to just over 100 people, but we have to guarantee at least 75%, so 79 seats. Now, when I say that we have to guarantee at least 79, it doesn't mean that if we don't reach that goal of 79 people that we can't meet there. It just means that we are committed to paying for 79 seats, whether or not we have that many people. The church is paying for the cost of the tickets, but we do need to know if you'll be attending because we're primarily concerned about whether we go over the limit of just 100 people, which would ultimately wind up with some people not being able to get in. So please let us know if you'll be attending so that we can avoid that situation. Now, one other thing to mention about this day is that because the theaters don't allow parties of this size to visit the concession stands individually, they require us to pre-order our concessions for our entire party ahead of time. And because this is just too confusing to make this work for a party of our size, we've actually told them we're not going to be ordering any concessions. Okay, so I know that's a little disappointing. We won't be ordering anything from the concession stands. And I know that you might be thinking, well, how would they be able to tell that I'm with this party of Xaris or not? And I don't know, they may not be able to, but we ask that you abide by this rule since this is what we've been told and agreed to with them. Having said that, you can probably bring some of your own snacks in your purse or maybe in a pocket, and I'm pretty sure that would be okay. I know that I have done that in the past myself. So, 9:15 at Century Theaters on October 3rd. If you can't come early but you'd still like to see the movie, you're perfectly free to do that. Just keep in mind that the movie will start at 10 a.m. promptly because there are no trailers. Getting back to our schedule, after October 3rd, we alternate between meeting here in this parking lot and at SASF. And one other general announcement, just so you know ahead of time, we have gone ahead and reserved SASF for every week that it is available, starting with the month of November all the way through the end of July 2022. So beginning with November, most of our services are going to be held at SASF. There are a number of weeks when the facilities are already reserved and unavailable in 2022. So at that time, we'll have to find alternatives for those weeks. But through the end of the year, we have the SASF facilities every week in November and December. Now, one thing, though, that we've decided is that on the Sundays after Christmas and New Year's, December 26th and January 2nd of next year, we have decided that those Sundays will be online services only. But other than that, we will be at SASF throughout the months of November and December, okay? All right, that's the announcements. I'm gonna go ahead and transition into my message at this time. Today I'm gonna have us look at a passage of scripture from the 7th chapter of the Gospel of Mark. And I want us to look at one particular detail in this passage that I've never really seen before, but it caught my eye, and it brought up all kinds of questions for me. And so I want us to explore this together. Now I'm going to go ahead and just read this passage of Scripture, and then provide a little bit of background, and then talk about this very interesting detail that Mark chose to include in this particular encounter that Jesus has with a deaf and a mute man. So beginning with verse 31 of chapter 7 of the Gospel of Mark, here's what it reads. Then Jesus left the vicinity of Tyre and went through Sidon, down to the Sea of Galilee, and into the region of the Decapolis. There some people brought to him a man who was deaf and could hardly talk, and they begged Jesus to place his hand on him. After he took him aside, away from the crowd, Jesus put his fingers into the man's ears. Then he spit and touched the man's tongue. He looked up to heaven and with a deep sigh said to him, Ephphatha, which means be opened. At this, the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. Jesus commanded them not to tell anyone, but the more he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed with amazement. He has done everything well, they said. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. Our passage starts out today in verse 31 by letting us know that Jesus left the vicinity to the north of Israel, the region of Phoenicia, where he had visited the Gentile cities of Tyre and Sidon, and that he had come back down into the region of Galilee and then eventually into the region of the Decapolis. It's interesting that Jesus would make a journey that far north into these two cities that were essentially holdouts of the remains of the Canaanite people that were originally in the land of Israel, in the land of Palestine, when Joshua first entered the Promised Land and drove them out back in the Old Testament. Phoenicia, on this map, is the region that these Canaanite people had resettled in. And although Israel had this off and on again relationship with these people, they were primarily seen to be an idolatrous culture to be avoided. So Jesus going that far north into their territory seems interesting. Scholars have speculated about this, some saying that he went there in order to get away from the pressing demands of the crowds that were beginning to follow him wherever he went. Others say that he went there in order to avoid an untimely death, as the Jewish religious leaders and Herod Antipas, who politically ruled the region of Galilee, were becoming increasingly hostile towards him. And some say that he went there as a precursor to announcing and opening the doors of God's kingdom to all people. Perhaps what we will be looking at today might shed a little bit of light to the reasoning behind Jesus' visit to these cities so far to the north. Although, having said that, that's not really the subject matter of my message. Beginning with verse 31 of chapter 7, Jesus returns from that region back into the area around the Sea of Galilee, and then into the region of the Decapolis, which is another region populated by Gentiles primarily, and known for their 10 major cities. By now, Jesus' reputation had spread beyond the borders of Israel, and Jesus was really no novice when it came to crowds. He was used to them, and they followed him wherever he went. The people in the Decapolis were no different. As soon as Jesus arrives into the area, people assemble, and some bring before him a man who was deaf and had a speech impediment. Now, we don't know what happened to this man. Maybe he could have heard at some time in the past. If so, he likely lost his hearing when he was very young, which would explain why his speaking isn't fully developed. But Jesus takes this man aside, away from the crowd. He then puts his fingers into the man's ears, which to me is really odd. I mean, back when I was young, we used to wet our finger and stick it into someone's ear, and we would call that a what? Do they still do that? We would call that a wet willy. Right? Jesus sticks both of his fingers into each of the man's ears. He then spits. No one really knows where Jesus spit. You might recall in another instance, Jesus used his spit to mix it with some dirt and make mud that he then applied to a blind man's eyes. But then he touches this man's tongue, which is again odd, and said, Ephphatah, which means be opened. The text then says that at this time the man's ears were opened, his tongue was loosened, and he began to speak plainly. After Jesus heals the man, he tells all of them that are present not to tell anyone, but the more that he did so, the more they kept talking about it. People were overwhelmed and amazed. He has done everything well, they say. He even makes the deaf hear and the mute speak. They couldn't stop talking about it, which I find to be a little bit ironic, because here Jesus gives this man the power to speak plainly and then tells him not to talk about what happened. But here's what I find really interesting about this encounter, something I've never really seen before. Before Jesus uttered the command that healed the man, he did something quite unexpected to me. It says that he looked up to heaven and he sighed. Now, for me, I probably would have expected Jesus to offer up a prayer or give praise to God, but this is somewhat of a surprising expression on Jesus' part. He sighed. What do you think that meant in that moment? You know, they say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, I think that this expression, this small little action on the part of Jesus could very well be worth 1,000 words as well. A series of studies was done in Norway that explored the context in which people sigh. Can you believe they actually did studies on this? So it looked at when people do it, and it also looked at, well, how is it perceived? So first, the researchers explored via questionnaires with the participants what emotional words they associated with sighing, and whether these emotional words were more active or passive or intense or subdued in nature. Additionally, they were asked how frequently they sigh and whether they do so alone or in the company of other people. Participants were also asked to study and interpret the sighs of other people that they witnessed. And the bottom line is, the researchers determined that sighing is felt to emanate from a negative reason 10 times more likely than from a positive reason. They say that although a sigh can come from a place of relief or sometimes even joy, it is 10 times more likely to come from a place of disappointment or defeat or frustration or boredom or longing. What's interesting is that when participants viewed other people sighing, they tended to interpret the sighs as coming from a place of sadness. But when they sighed themselves, they felt it was coming more from a place of frustration. So what do we make of Jesus' sigh in this encounter? What emotional place did it emanate from? And why do you think that was the case? We're going to kind of take a look at some of the possible answers. But let me say up front that this is mostly speculation on my part, because I don't know why he sighed. But I do think his sighing says something very significant about the heart of Jesus in that moment. Now, there are many who say that Jesus was sighing because he was identifying with this man's condition. That whenever Jesus saw people who were tormented and suffering as a result of our broken world, whether that suffering came from an unfortunate circumstance or incident or from the evil that is brought about by other people, that Jesus reacted viscerally to this. That Jesus sighed because he knew that his Father never intended human life to be this way. Humanity wasn't created to suffer in such ways. Ears weren't made to be deaf. Tongues weren't made to stutter. And life was not created to end in death. And that this man brought these feelings to the surface of Jesus' consciousness. And he felt deeply for the man. He felt his pain, felt his frustration, and his lifelong struggle. And he groaned in solidarity with this man, which could have been a form of prayer offered up to God. Because we know that the Apostle Paul says that the Spirit of God groans on our behalf in ways that words cannot express. So I don't doubt that Jesus had this feeling, and maybe even often during his time of walking among people who were broken and hurting. But yet, I think the circumstances might suggest that Jesus' sigh came from a different place. I wonder if in this moment Jesus sighed because he was so often misunderstood by the people that he was trying to lead into this new life of God's kingdom that he was establishing. Jesus came to teach and to embody what the love of God, the forgiveness of God, the justice of God, and the salvation of God looked like, and how it would be established, and how it would work in this world. He came to tell them not just to repent and change the direction of their lives through the ways in which they outwardly express their faith in God, but that they would begin an inward transformation, to have the kind of heart from out of which the commands of God for love, justice, and mercy would flow naturally. As I've mentioned a number of times, his revolution was one of the heart, not one that was going to result in Israel once again becoming a powerful and sovereign kingdom in this world. But the healings and miracles that he performed, and which were certainly evidence of the inbreaking of God's kingdom and a foretaste of the fullness of God's kingdom to come, was misinterpreted and misunderstood by many who believe that they just served to reinforce this idea that Jesus was the kind of Messiah who was going to lead them to the promise of political independence and power. Maybe Jesus sighs in this story because he is the Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of God, the Savior. But he knows that the coming of God's kingdom is going to happen subtly, under the radar, through much sacrifice and without the fanfare or victories that almost everyone in that time associated with worldly kingdoms. It's going to come by very unassuming, quiet, and even secret ways. It's going to come by the power of God, yes, but it will come when we take up our crosses and live a life of self-sacrifice and follow Jesus, not as a worldly, powerful leader, but as our Lord and Savior. So that's maybe why Jesus sighed, because he was so often misunderstood, and this situation would have ultimately only furthered that misunderstanding among many people. Or I wonder if Jesus sighs because rarely does his healing achieve what he's ultimately hoping to accomplish in people. You see, physical healing was not ultimately what Jesus was wanting for the people that he ministered to. Wholeness was what he wanted to happen in their lives. Restoring the lonely, the isolated, and those who were ostracized back to healthy community. Providing people with hope and with human flourishing that comes from right relationships with God and other people, and from a heart that is centered on love. That is what he wanted. And I'm not sure that physically healing someone actually makes that happen for them. Sometimes, quite honestly, I think it might work against it. We saw in our last movie that we looked at from our movie series, the movie Sound of Metal, that even if the character Reuben had been healed of his deafness, I don't think that would have made him whole. In fact, I believe it would have only served to perpetuate the brokenness in his soul that he was continuing to cover up through his desperate need for music and performance. And at the end of the movie, when he takes off his cochlear implants and he's sitting there in silence, it's almost as if you can see his soul finally reaching a more peaceful place. You see, Jesus is providing this man with hearing and speech. He didn't have these before. And these were physical impediments that in those days were often the basis for being shunned by people in his community. But what will he do now that he has acquired these new powers and gifts? If he uses them to treat others the way that he was treated, if he winds up misusing his new powers, then maybe it would have been better for him had he never been able to speak or hear at all. how many people that Jesus healed went on to truly live their lives in ways that honored God and furthered the work of his kingdom in this world. The text says that the people who witnessed it were astonished, and they were overwhelmed with amazement. But did this bring about the kind of life change in them that Jesus was wanting to bring? And so maybe Jesus sighed because his physical healing rarely produced the kind of change that he was hoping for in the person that he healed or in the people that witnessed it. But I also wonder if Jesus sighs because he grieves about the distortion that occurs over the good news that he's wanting to communicate. As soon as Jesus heals the deaf man, he asks the crowds, in fact, he orders the crowd to keep the miracle to themselves. Why does he do this? In part, I believe it's because Jesus needs more time. More time for the seeds of his kingdom work and teaching to take root. More time for even his own disciples to come around from their own failed perceptions about his mission and purpose, and therefore better understand their mission and purpose once he's gone. He doesn't want his growing fame to inflame his enemies and to hasten his death, as he knew that it was already doing. But I wonder if he also tells the crowds to keep quiet because he's aware of the distorted stories that they will disseminate as a result of what they witnessed. Stories that come from the people in the crowd who see only what they want to see. Stories from people who are only there for the spectacle of it all. People more interested in witnessing the miraculous and who have little or no concern about what is truly going on, what it really means underneath it all. What kind of stories will they tell to other people about what they witnessed and about what they believe about Jesus? And how misleading will it be to those who are listening to those stories, those who maybe really need to hear the good news of the kingdom that Jesus is bringing? Jesus taught over and over again about the depth and the breadth of the love of God. He did it through parables. He did it through the ways in which he treated people. But it seems to me that the miraculous healings that he performed would cause stories about Jesus to take on a life of their own in ways that would undermine what he was really all about. So maybe that's why Jesus sighed in that moment. You see, the healing of Jesus is always much more complicated than it looks. Jesus is pressed upon by individuals to help this deaf and mute man who has been suffering from this condition for probably most of his life. This was a common occurrence in the life of Jesus at this time in his ministry. And he had performed enough healings by this time that he was aware of the kind of impact that it generally had upon people. Well, he compassionately responds to the crowd's request, and he heals this man, but before he does so, he sighs. And I'm still not sure where that sigh was emanating from in Jesus' heart. Perhaps it involved a little bit of all that we discussed. But one thing I'm fairly confident of is that it didn't come from a positive place. It likely came from a discouraged place, or a frustrated place, or a saddened place. A place that I think I would say most of us are familiar with during this past year and a half, as our lives have been turned upside down by the recent events around the world and in our country. I think that we've all done a lot of sighing. If not out loud, then certainly in our spirits, haven't we? The past year and a half have demonstrated just how much our world is not the way that it should be. How much brokenness and divisiveness and suffering we have endured and that we have contributed to in this world. Yesterday marked the 20th anniversary of 9/11, a day that was filled with sadness and sighs that continue on even today. And just in this past month, our troops have pulled out of Afghanistan, with the result being that the Taliban quickly took that region back over. And many have sighed and groaned over that development. But yet we have to remember that back in the 1980s, when the Soviet Union was occupying Afghanistan, that our country was providing arms and supplies to a group that we saw as freedom fighters at that time. And it's from out of some of these very same people that the Taliban would rise, and who we now are fighting against ourselves some 30 years later. And I only say this to make the point that although we've endured sufferings ourselves, we are complicit in some, if not much, of the suffering that goes on in this world, both as a nation and as individuals. The world is sighing. That's the image that the Apostle Paul gives when he says that the whole creation is groaning in Romans chapter 8. But I will close with a prophetic picture from the book of Isaiah. The prophet Isaiah writes in the 35th chapter of his book, "Then will the eyes of the blind be opened, and the ears of the deaf unstopped. Then will the lame leap like a deer, and the mute tongue shout for joy. Water will gush forth in the wilderness and streams in the desert. The burning sand will become a pool, the thirsty ground bubbling springs. In the haunts where jackals once lay, grass and reeds and papyrus will grow, and a highway will be there. It will be called the way of holiness. It will be for those who walk on that way. The unclean will not journey on it. Wicked fools will not go about on it. No lion will be there, nor any ravenous beast. They will not be found there. But only the redeemed will walk there, and those the Lord has rescued will return. They will enter Zion with singing. Everlasting joy will crown their heads. Gladness and joy will overtake them, and sorrow and sighing will flee away." One day, sorrow and sighing will be no more. And perhaps that was some of what Jesus felt as he healed the deaf and mute man. A sadness over his condition, coupled with the thought that it won't be that way for that much longer. The brokenness of this world will one day be redeemed, and this includes our own brokenness. One day we will fully know Jesus, even as we are fully known by him now. So we will no longer misunderstand or misrepresent or live in ways that bring about suffering to this world. But until then, I think that we must live humbly and understand that in God's eyes, all of us are in need of healing and wholeness and deliverance. We've all sighed, but we are also the cause of sighing in this world. And I think that recognizing that is an important step to entering into God's kingdom.